Hi, how are you? This is Rob Skiff. I'm with Oplerno, and we're interviewing Joe Walker Rettberg, who is a professor at the University of Bergen in Norway. And we're going to talk about all things related to technology in terms of blogging, and also how individuals create their identity online, and what that sort of means for society in general, coming over in the next 5 or 10 years. So thank you very much for coming and doing this interview. I know that it's late at night for you all over in Europe, and we're filming this in the afternoon in the States. So again, thanks a lot.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, how did you get it to University of Bergen? I heard about it first through their involvement in kind of computer modeling and way of thinking called system dynamics. And they have a really amazing PhD program in system dynamics, and actually one of really, 3 or 4 in the world, and I think the best one in Europe and in Eurasia. So how'd you find out about Bergen, and how'd you get here?
Actually, my parents were academics. They came here on sabbatical in the 70s.
Hmm.
And just never went home. Actually, they
Okay.
went, came back. So I'm actually an early transplant. I've been here since I was a kid, actually. So I was really happy when I started studying. I was interested in hypertext, was sort of the early 90s, and I was just thrilled to learn that. Suddenly realized I was doing my MA in comparative literature here, and I realized that this wonderful guy, I'd been reading his book Cybertext, that he was in an office down the hall. So I went and knocked on his door very sort of nervously, an MA student, and asked if I could talk with him because I was interested in, I'd read his book. And now, of course, I realize that for a student to have read your book is kind of awesome, actually. So, but I was amazed that he would talk to me. So it turned out to be a great place to do research on digital media.
So in the early 90s, and who was that professor?
That's Espen Aarseth. He wrote the book Cybertext in the mid 90s, and he was one of the founders of the Game Studies magazine journal and so forth. So he's one of the founders of studying computer games, really.
Yeah, I came across my interest in using technology in the classroom comes from a group actually in Sweden and Norway, Asa Sariman, who wrote a book called Imologies, which the really interesting work was being done in Norway and Sweden, and then and then all those hypertexts. It was a big yellow book called Hypertext with all these articles in it and talking about how reading had changed. That you couldn't that now you had narratives where there were many possible pathways through something. So it was sort of like perfect with sort of like the postmodern shtick, Frederick Jameson and post-structuralist theory, where there were multiple meanings to things in text and no one way to get through it. And using the internet and using hypertext in an old Apple computer, it was amazing. What we now know as wikis,
Yeah.
and really, yeah, Wikipedia, wikis, and the way in which some of us are using podcasts and our academic writing to create links where people can go off. You click on an underline and you can read actually the original documents or pull something up. It's a great thing. So yeah, that you were very early on in that work then, if you were in the early 90s.
Yes, although I discovered that, people had been working on this for decades already, which was, I was so lucky to actually, get to make connections with people. Espen Aarseth became my advisor later. He just sent me off to conferences, the hypertext conferences. And
Oh,
so,
wow.
yeah, but I found all that so inspiring. I read, so Vannevar Bush is like, they talk about Vannevar Bush as the grandfather of hypertext. He wrote right after the Second World War, he wrote, we've developed all this technology for warfare, for medicine, for everything except for how to think. We're not using technology to help us think better, he wrote. And so he proposed this device he called the Memex, which is pretty much sort of like the internet if you didn't have digital technology. So it uses microfilm, and he imagined making links between different microfilm documents. And one of my favorite quotes from that is he talks about how in the future there'll be this profession of trailblazers, and they'll be the people who create the links. And I just love that idea. Quite a lot of trailblazers who, you know, people who make links, and we have the perfect environment to do it in on the web.
Yeah, and everybody can participate, and it's really interesting that those hierarchies are really, and we can talk about this. Those hierarchies are really, I think, kind of breaking down. You know, in the mid '90s, my first attempt at a master's program, I was at the University of Chicago, and I was writing on how technology changes hierarchies in the classroom and how it had a chance to break down and change the way in which we're delivering higher ed. And my advisor, who's in the anthro department, hated it. Okay, because, you know, it was taking away that privileged piece of knowledge. Have you encountered sort of the same thing? I mean, you're involved in a research of something that is, you know, and you kind of hint at it, I think, in a couple of in the readings, that you're not a technology is going to liberate us camp. You're in much more of the pragmatic camp, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Well, I love technology. I see amazing potential, but there's also so many ways in which it's certainly not a simple, more democracy, more freedom, more empowerment. There's all sorts of new power structures that are being developed with it, I think. And I think, as you said, I certainly experienced many people like your professor in the 90s who I think feel very threatened by just the shift in power, which is really interesting to me. One of the first blogging experiences I had that really showed that was when Henry Jenkins, he's a really well-known professor of media. He was at MIT at the time, and he wrote an opinion piece, an op-ed on blogs in like 2001 or 2 or something like that. And he published it in, I think, the MIT Technology Review or something like that. And he said bloggers are the cockroaches.
Yeah.
Taking oh. And of course, the blogosphere exploded. Everyone was like outraged at this professor dude thinking he knew anything about blogging. And the thing that I thought really sort of showed that things had shifted was when Henry Jenkins, the professor, had to go and defend himself by posting something on one of his students' blogs, because that was the only way he could actually participate in that conversation, right? And to me, that really exemplified a shift in power. He was relying on his students' blog. Then
yeah.
Jenkins is definitely taken to the web. I mean, he surfed that wave pretty thoroughly, I'd say. So, but there's definitely a shift that happened there that still there are people who aren't quite, you know, secure in the ways things work.
There seems to be, you know, there are always, you know, right now, the digital, you know, they talk about the digital natives and the people that have, you know, the immigrants to, you know, to the digital space. Although for a lot of us, we've been involved in something, you know, digital or some in-between space since we were little kids. You know, even though I'm 48 and, you know, you're probably in your 40s, maybe. So, yeah. You know, the same deal. And now we've got this really weird situation where the people, at least the way I see it in the States, sort of people who are in charge of institutions, especially in higher ed, are so disconnected, many of them, from understanding that the old media, whether we're talking about newspapers, TV, or cable, is really being, you know, hardly anyone pays too much attention to it if you're younger, okay? You know, if you're under the age of 35 and you want to figure out what's going on, you don't even go to Facebook anymore, okay? You know, Facebook is for grandmothers and grandfathers and old people. People are using like Snapchat, Instagram, and all of that. And the blogs have a huge following, and in some ways more people reading blogs, reading blog entries by certain bloggers than are reading, you know, newspaper columnists.
I wrote an op-ed every few weeks for the local newspaper here in Bergen for a year, and they kept telling me, remember, your audience is the 55 plus generation, because this is in the print newspaper. So you've got to write it so 55 plus year olds are going to be able to read it, which, you know, that tells you something about who reads newspapers, right? But the other thing is here, I recently saw a survey where was recently a discussion where a young woman, she's a 15-year-old entrepreneur who started like a fashion blog site that's making, you know, tens of thousands. And she told the media, you know, young people don't read blogs anymore. They're for 40-year-old housewives who are interested in fashion, makeup, or, you know, interior design or something. And so I actually talked to a researcher who's actually done surveys and so forth. And he says, yeah, you know, the last 5 years, the average age of blog readers, at least in Norway, has increased. So now the average blog reader is about 35. So that might mean, I'm not sure I'm quite convinced. I think the young people are still probably on blogs, but maybe they're moving even further. Maybe we're losing our grip.
Yeah, I think we may be, you know, there's always that danger, which is why I try to, I've got good friends who have, you know, kids, and try to, hey, what are you guys using? How are you communicating? And seeing where those networks are. You know, I think that depending on, there's so many different cultures now that have the ability to communicate within their own groups, but also that you can see, okay, like the secret language of teenagers, okay, is now, if you know, want to lurk, it's in Instagram and Snapchat.
Yeah.
And if you want to see what, you know, suburban Americans are doing, then go on Facebook. Okay. If you want to see what, you know, more technical people, or, you know, interesting, like some, you know, subjects that are more scholarly, then it's hitting the blogs. So it's, you know, the medium is the message, even more, as, you know, McLuhan said, but that old stuff, the TV, you know, national television stations, all those things that were controlled by the establishment just seem to have fizzled. I mean, they, you know, Rachel Maddow, who's a big commentator in the States, she has, I think, only about 250,000 people watching her every night. And she's touted as this huge voice. And they're... What?
DJ Khaled has way more than that watching his Snapchat.
Yeah. 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 It's crazy. And so all those things that we think about, who is creating the voices,
yeah,
you know, is just, you know, is upended. And it's really, really fascinating.
The thing that worries me is that there's a bit of now I'm going to sound like an old person, but just watching Snapchat, because I've been trying to understand Snapchat recently, and it's the stories that I can understand the most easily because they're openly available. And if you look at like the live stories that they create, it's a very particular voice, and I've read they're watched by like 20-30 million people, each of these daily little, you know, 2-minute live stories. And so, well, for instance, yesterday it was a national day in Norway. So for me, I have small children. It's all about the children, you know, and so forth, and the parades. Snapchat's version of the live story of Norway's celebration was all about like the 23-year-olds drinking champagne and like, I don't see that. Where is that? And it's interesting because it gives you a very particular view of what does the world look like, right?
Right.
And sure, previously that idea of what the world looked like was determined by television and television and newspapers and so forth, mostly run by old guys, I suppose. But I think things like Snapchat are actually going to have a huge role in defining what we think the world is like. Like I know about going to Mecca for the Hajj last year by watching the Snapchat live story about it, which, after seeing their version of Norway's National Day, I'm guessing that's a pretty skewed vision of it, really. It sort of looked a bit like a party, actually.
Sure. Yeah, tough to tell. I mean, I'm really exploring a lot on Instagram. And one of the things I like to do is go running. So I'm exploring, you know, people who do trail running and ultra running. But I came across a subculture of people who are traveling around North America or the world in vans that they've redone. Okay. And they're living in vans and working in sort of their digital nomads. It's different than, you know, the cultures of people living in vans in Europe. It's more along the line of, you know, it's sort of, you know, harkens. It's just different. But that I would never be able to find pictures, daily pictures, or people to communicate with 5 years ago. if I wanted to create a sense of community. So it's almost as if, you know, the notion of community no longer, it is place-based, but it can extend out to be interest-based, which is completely mind-blowing when I think about what it was like in the 90s, where we were, you know, trolling the Usenet groups, okay, and finding different things. And it was like, that was amazing. You know, we can, you know, look up obscure science fiction authors and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you think we're using this enough in higher education? I mean, there's amazing stuff our students are learning, but is it, I don't know.
No.
How can we use it, do you think?
It's tough because you know, I think that there are very few, when you get trained in academia, you get trained in a particular way. And, you know, it's sort of discipline and punishment a la Foucault. And you really are taught methodologies, and what is rewarded is really thinking inside the box. You know, you have to publish certain papers in certain journals. You can be wild, but not that wild, or it's sort of like, look at all of us, we're all wild together. So that maverick quality that you get online isn't necessarily there. And I think that people, the net seems to me in this aspect a lot more egalitarian. In other words, you want to find the new voice. That's why you're going out and surfing. I think academia still wants to focus the voice on the professor.
Yeah, which is nice if you're the professor, but
yeah, nice if you're there, but not if you're not. Yeah.
Yeah, I think universities have been built to sort of they've been built to conserve knowledge, right? I mean, they probably literally were, I think, but that's not necessary. Well, we do need to conserve knowledge, and but that's maybe not the main thing we need to be doing today, because the knowledge, there's so much knowledge, you can access all this knowledge, but you need to be learning how to use it, how to connect it, right?
Yeah,
which is maybe another thing to learn.
Yeah, praxis. Like, you know, Vannevar Bush was always interested in application.
Yeah.
Or you know, you think of John Perry I always pronounce his name incorrectly. Burlaw, the guy who did the Whole Earth catalog, and Buckminster Fuller.
Yes.
You know, who sort of is, you know, a patron saint of the internet, although I don't think he would necessarily really like it. All those people were really eclectic.
Yes.
And also, you know, well, Bush was definitely into the hierarchies, but the other guys, you know, weren't. And also, you know, we're also all talking about guys. And one of the really great things about blogging and the net and Instagram right now is you have voices who are not from the establishment. And I don't want to call them the marginal voices, because they're not marginal in their own communities, but you can really literally reach out and talk and interact with people anywhere on the planet, and they can have a voice. And that's very different than what it was like in terms of the dialogue at the universities, you know, 10 years ago or even today.
Absolutely.
What do you think is sort of, what do you see as sort of some of the trends in higher education in Norway that sort of will shake things up, or sort of the trends that you see that are going to push and change the way in which, you know, University of Bergen is situated in Norway and situated in the European Union? How's that for a crazy question?
Yeah, right. I think it's hard to change universities. I mean, you know, I'm on the university steering committee for digitizing education and so forth, and we're definitely trying to do things, but well, one of the things that surprised me doing that kind of work is that some of the most conservative voices, to my mind, are from the students, actually. The students want videotaped lectures. They want podcast lectures, and that's it. That's what they seem to think of. Oh, and being able to use a computer for their exams, which is fair enough. They should be in 2016, right? But the videotape lectures, it just seems such a such an odd usage, really, of technology. It's sort of enshrining this idea of like the professor is the font of knowledge, and I can just sit there and listen, and if I watch the video enough times, I'll know it, and I'll be fine.
Do they want different ways to connect? Like, there's the video lectures, and then there's taking the exam. But you know, most great education is in small groups where you're having discussions, and you're working, or you're working on projects. Do you find that are they demanding that, or is it more along the line of, hey, I want sort of Coursera or edX?
It's not even TEDx. It's very strange though. The most vote. I mean, we have a pretty strong student democracy. There's like, you know, I don't know, 17,000 students. They have a student parliament. There's a lot of activity, and the students who get voted into the parliament, largely, I think there's a lot of students who just, they want easy learning, to be honest with you, which is a little bit sad. But I also think that we don't really offer them enough, and we're certainly trying. There's a lot of individual teachers who are doing wonderful things using technology in really creative ways, but it's sort of spread out, you know. And then you have the big 500 student, you know, introduction to psychology or economics or mathematics, and they are still the lecture-based classes, you know. So I think we have more of those huge lecture classes than you do in the US, probably. In my subject, digital culture, we don't have any, but you know.
Yeah, I think it's in Europe, from what I know about both Europe and sort of North America, the first 2 years you have these large, all introductory classes are large, 500 to 1,000. Not to be cynical, but that's where the universities make their money, because you have students paying full rate and really accessing education that they could get for free, because an introductory class, you can get great introductory classes anywhere for nothing. But what you can't do is, as you get higher up, you know, in the more advanced classes, you need smaller classes and you need really, really good instruction. We're not going to be able to automate that. You know, when we want to talk about blogs, we don't want to listen to a lecture by you. We want to talk with you and get into a discussion, or maybe see a discussion like this one, but then be able to interact with our classmates and you if we have any questions. But the revenue streams are still controlled by those introductory classes. And colleges, at least in the US, are, and in, you know, Canada, where you have to pay more, are definitely afraid of switching that system, because they will lose their main source of revenue in their business model.
Yeah, we have free tuition still in Norway, but there's obviously a limited amount of funding that the university gets, you know, so people are very aware of, you know, okay, how many teacher hours are we getting per credit per student? And it's like, it's, yeah. And I think that sort of hinders creativity, but that's too down a view on it. There are a lot of people, I mean, every year I hear of more, you know, creative, interesting projects, but they're spread out so much that it's sort of hard to really get a proper view of them, I think.
Yeah, and the question is, you know, where are they going to be done? You know, in the States, because of costs and what people are paying adjuncts, I think we're seeing a migration out of the universities as being those centers of innovative teaching. We're seeing it out to like Oplerno or other groups that are getting created. It'll be interesting to see with Europe's, you know, like you said, free education. Not to, you know, sound like a libertarian, but whenever somebody says something is free, I always look at my wallet, because somebody's paying it. You know?
Of course, our tax money pays it.
Yeah, and the question is, how long can that last, given you know, given certain constraints? Whether you're talking about the, you know, migration crisis, or you know, the aging of, you know, Northern Europe and the demographic issues, how long can those, you know, can those dynamics remain without you know, really impacting, without things changing? Because it's, you know, in where I live, population is declining dramatically of school age students. And so you've got all this infrastructure that it's been built and all these people dependent upon these jobs, but not the students. that can afford to go.
Mm.
So, tell me a little bit more about what's the most interesting thing or the research that you're doing right now that you're the most excited to sort of delve into? Is it the Snapchat piece? Is it is it the blogging you hit absolutely perfectly in terms of timing, okay, when
yeah.
loading? What now is really sort of intrigues you?
My project this year was supposed to be machine vision, like how we maybe see the world differently because we're seeing so much of it through different kinds of technology. Like I'm seeing you right now. I've got my iPhone. You've got your laptop.
Yep.
We've got lighting, filters, fiber optic cables across oceans. There's all sorts of mediation going on. So I've become really interested in the visual aspects of that. And, but then I've sent in my grant applications, waiting. Snapchat comes along. I'm like, wow, this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So right now, I have to admit, Snapchat really fascinates me. I think it's a really interesting, different mode of storytelling, of communication than earlier. And maybe it's like I just love when things change, when something new emerges, So that was blogs a few years ago. And I think Snapchat and that kind of place is where the changes and how we communicate are happening. And I'm not that obviously, the private snaps that people send to each other are huge, but I'm always more interested in the big story, the stories we tell each other, how we communicate in a larger group. So I'm really interested in the stories that people share with the general public, and also the way Snapchat is becoming like a news provider for a generation, I suppose. That maybe sounds a bit big, but
No, it is until the new flavor comes along, which is,
well, yeah, there'll be something else after Snapchat, obviously.
Yeah, like
but Snapchat is a point in time where things are, people are jumping on the bandwagon. There's news journalism happening in it. There's marketing is starting to happen. And there's a lot of really creative storytelling happening there as well. At the same time as just everybody is sharing little snippets, right? My neighbors are sharing pictures of their cats and so forth, which is great,
Sure. Cats and unfortunately pornography seem to be the main drivers of bandwidth traffic on the planet.
I actually only got one snap of a naked torso on Snapchat, which I think is pretty good. I think it's better than its reputation.
Wow.
Although maybe it's that I'm old enough to not really attract that stuff, which is good.
Your book on blogging that you offered, there are a couple of really interesting things that you've done. One is, I really like the fact, and I think everybody does, that you've put a lot of your articles on academia.edu. And are in the top 3% of the scholars that are on academia.edu for your views, for how many views and articles have been downloaded, which is great because it makes the peer-reviewed journals or just the stuff that we read accessible to everybody instead of it being behind a paywall. And in your blogging, in your book about blogs, you talk a little bit about how people create their personalities or how they record their lives. Now, we used to record them in the diary, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It was our own private little, our own private, space. I mean, I've still got one that I use, every day. But then there's the digital versions of a blog. And now, where are people... Facebook is sort of a kind of a diary way that people keep track of their lives. But what are sort of the ways in which you see that, see that changing or transforming to how people sort of like remember and memory about who they are?
Well, I think we've always, we kind of create our personality, our idea of who we are by telling stories about ourselves, right? I mean, by negotiating our own memories, we change our memories a bit according to how they fit into a story. And I think also we've had the idea that diaries used to be private is, I think, not really quite. Well, some diaries clearly were private. My diary as a teenager was very private. But back 100, 200 years ago, the more common thing was for diaries and personal letters to be shared in a smallish group, you know.
Yeah.
The Puritans apparently used to use their diaries as kind of like spiritual, like it was almost like homework. You had to write in your diary, you know, what you did good, what was bad, how you were working to become more at one with God, and then you would share it with members of your congregation, sort of to help support each other in you know, improving your life, which actually is quite a lot like the quantified self movement, where, you know, you measure yourself in order to improve yourself. And I think what we see in social media is this interesting, you know, the negotiation of the private and the sharing, because that social sharing is also a really important part of becoming yourself and figuring out who you are in relation to others as well, I think.
But the sharing, you know, they're sharing with your close friends, but then I kind of call it the Kim Kardashianization of our lives. It seems as though more and more people are trying to, you know, overshare, or at least from, you know, from my standpoint, from, you know, a Vermonter, you know, sitting in New England with that, you know, Protestant, you know, Puritan background, that the oversharing and the notion, the quest for celebrities, it's almost as if our valuation is how many likes do we get? How many, you know, how many shares did we receive? What's our following? Okay, all to sort of create this, you know, like you said, this quantified self, but it's a self that's measured in celebrity where, you know, I mean, when Pepys was writing his journals, or Johnson, or you know, say Shonagon, or in Tales of the Genji, when these people were writing, they were not interested in having like everybody read their stuff, or were they?
Oh, maybe they were.
Yeah, maybe they were.
Alice Marwick wrote this really interesting book called Status Update, which was like an ethnography of Twitter and the whole sort of when Twitter was started and the Silicon Valley, kind of where social media was born. And her argument is that Web 2.0, because she did her research just before it really started being called social media in about 2008 or so, and she says, you know, Web 2.0, one thing it has is sort of Californian ideology, which is sort of there's a liberalism and sort of an idea of everyone's equal, except it's sort of not. There's a meritocracy too, right? Where, oh, if you are rich because you have a startup, it's probably because you were the best person too. So, and also this sort of belief in entrepreneurship. So she says, okay, these social metrics are sort of leading us to, they're training us to become little self-branding entrepreneurs. She says, like, schools in the 20th century were sort of, 20th century schools were sort of designed to teach us to be good factory workers, right? So they got the school bell. Everyone has to sit on the little desks. It's just like training you to be a factory worker. And that's not what we need today. So what we have instead is social media, which trains us all to be, you know, self-employed little entrepreneurs who work for the likes, which I think is a really interesting, oh my God, higher education is actually, I mean, we don't need higher education. We just need to teach people Twitter. No, we definitely need higher education. They need to think critically about Twitter.
But there is that self-promotion thing. Can you give the name of the author again and the book? Because I'm going to go out and read it like after we get done the interview.
Alice Marwick, and the title of the book is Status Update. There's a subtitle, but I can't remember it.
Status Update.
Yeah, it's a pretty good book. It's pretty readable.
Yeah, getting the likes and getting the social connections. It's interesting, you know, to bring it back to academia. One of the things for tenure review in the States is, what's your academic impact? And you know,
gosh.
And it's hysterical to hear people. Well, I've published 14 articles in these journals with these rankings, and I got into a discussion in a class. Well, how many people have actually read your work, professor? Okay, or how many people, you know, I mean, there's citations, but that takes, you know, 10 years. If you're really, really good, you're going to get cited in other people's stuff, which is going to get cited in others. But today, information and the knowledge changes so quickly. How do you know, how can you measure? And the only way seems to be downloads, per se.
Yeah.
And and the only group that's doing that, and that sort of flies in the face of how tenure gets reviewed, okay? And it also, the only groups that are doing that is, it seems like academia.edu, that makes it so easy. I can instantly see if this article was good because I know how many downloads it's gotten. And when I look at different universities and who has published what and what their downloads are in academia.edu, it's interesting that that doesn't correlate, or at least it didn't with the department I was in. It never correlated well with actually who was in charge or who was looked upon as the good scholar.
That's a good point. And I was recently trying to figure out, how journals get indexed and so forth, because I've been involved with some open source or open access journals that haven't been being indexed by, Scopus and Web of Science and so forth. And I was trying to figure out how this works, actually, because I signed up for ResearchGate, which is a bit like academia.edu, except it sucks information up from these bibliographic indexes. So I went and asked our librarians, and it turns out it's the big publishing company. Like, I think it was an Elsevier, but it's a big publishing companies own these indexes that are huge commercial sites, and they're the ones that attribute, impact factors, and they send their data to all the library catalogs and to ResearchGate. And so I don't know if you saw the other day, there was some an MA student at Aarhus University in Denmark had he downloaded all the user profiles off OkCupid, and he made it openly available. Which is a huge breach of research ethics, right?
Yep. The IBB, Institutional Review Board, IRB, is not going to like that. No.
Oh my gosh, no. And he says, oh no, but I didn't run it through the IRB because it was research done in my spare time. And I just wrote the name of the university because I'm also doing it. But anyway, so I started Googling this guy, and he's really gamed the system. You look at Google Scholar and ResearchGate, and he has a lot of citations and a high, like, an impact factor and so forth.
Right.
And if you look at where they are, he started an open access journal of his own with open peer review, somehow got it into these, somehow got it into the indexing system. So it actually has an official impact factor, even though it's just him and his mates, and they review each other's articles quite openly, and so he's published his own papers in his own journal and gets his mates to cite it, and most of it's self-citations. But that gets into these commercial. It's like, oh my God, metrics can be abused, but those are sort of traditional metrics that he's gaining, right?
Well,
maybe it's the academia metrics. Oh, you could probably create a spam bot that just downloaded your own paper 3 million times.
Well, yeah, you could. Yeah, you could. It's interesting, though, that you bring up the self-referential pieces with peer-reviewed journal articles, because when I was writing my first dissertation, I wanted to look at the relationship. That's another story. You can read about it if you want to read my book published of my second dissertation, which is available on Amazon. If you Google my name, it's called The University. Here, that's a shameless plug. But one of the things that I found is that in studying poverty with food stamps, which is a program in the U.S., and this thing called direct certification, that I noticed that the people who were running the programs were professors from prestigious universities whose students were reviewing their own kind of articles, and the self-referential publishing game was actually also spilling over into the consulting and the government contracts piece. And I think we see that this young man in Denmark, okay, gaming the system with his mates, but that happens at schools and universities all the time. It's just called, the Society for such and such, or that, the small inner clique. It's just maybe now we can see it more, because we have the good old boy and the good old girl networks are more transparent because we can do the analysis.
That might be true. That might be true. I guess anytime you set up a system with rules, someone's gonna, break the rules, game the system.
Totally. Just have to have it be transparent. See, so in Norway, the position of the professor, you guys don't use a lot of adjunct labor, correct?
A lot less. because we're all government employees, and so there's sort of strict rules about, you know, you can't have someone employed for longer than so much time without them getting a permanent job, which is like tenure. But it's still a problem. I mean, I think, but it's so much less than in the US. I think I can't remember exactly. I think our university has something like 15% of the teachers are adjunct, basically, which is higher than we want, but I think it's still less than many US universities, unfortunately.
Well, in the US, it's about anywhere between 50 and 75%, or
Right,
sometimes
which is
higher.
pretty shocking, really. It's a
Yeah.
terrible situation of people. It's
And
frightening. I mean, it's at a level where you sort of don't really want to recommend to smart young people that they become academics, which is terrible.
yeah, true. You really have to take a long look in, you know, the States if you want to do that. What about on the student end? Okay. Students don't graduate with a lot of, obviously, if the education is free, don't graduate with a lot of debt. Okay. But is there a limitation for the amount of slots or positions that people have to be able to study in a program? How do you allocate those coveted positions to people, since it would be free?
Oh, for students?
Yeah,
Oh, it's based on grades, the same as other. I mean, a few places there's an audition or there's an interview or something like that, but for most places it's just whatever grades you have from high school, the best students will get a spot. So there's lots of very competitive programs, even so.
sure.
Um,
What about graduate studies? When people get their degree, when people have, you know, gotten their bachelor's or the equivalent and they want to do more, how does that work here? Work there?
um, the master's degree is pretty common here. I think more than in the US. A lot of people do a master's degree, and that's the same with free tuition and so forth. But competitive to get a spot, you know, and it's not financed by. So the master students don't do teaching, or they're not research assistants or anything like that. They just have their free tuition. But for the PhD level, it's very, very competitive. But if you get your PhD fellowship, it's like you get paid as much as a full-time nurse or police officer, I think. Oh, maybe they get paid even more in the US. I don't know. You get paid like, I don't know, certainly $50,000-$60,000 a year, which is a great salary, right, for a PhD student. I know.
Yeah.
I know. It's kind of awesome. But it's extremely difficult to get one of those fellowships.
Sure.
And right now, you know, budget cuts are happening right now, so there's even less available. So, but I think the good side of that is we're not, at least we're not educating way more PhDs. I mean, I think one of the problems in the US is there's such an incentive to just teach more, you know, accept more PhD students into a program than are ever going to get jobs. You use them as cheap labor for teaching. They pay fees, and so there's this sort of incentive to create even more unemployed, well, or adjuncts, I guess, unemployed academics and adjuncts, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it's I think you described the system pretty well. From my point of view, one of the things that's sort of sad is, you know, we've got 2 billion people on the planet who want access to higher education. And we don't have the capacity, like we're not going to build, you know, extra University of Bergens. You know, we're not going to, you know, you guys can't double the numbers of students that you have in your programs, but yet we really need to create that capacity so that we can get at those, you know, 2 billion who want more education globally. And how are we going to do that without using the digital technologies? And also using, you know, that is a place where that supplementary, you know, all those PhDs who are educated who can teach, hopefully it's a good percentage of them. That would be great if we could deploy those to be teaching that 2 billion. Because there's certainly, hey, I don't think you waste anything if you educate people. It's a good thing.
I think that would be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we are starting to, there's a lot of, not just formal MOOCs, but there's all sorts of other learning environments where people are teaching themselves so much today, I think. So, yeah, there's a lot of good things happening.
Well, listen, thank you very much for your time. We've talked for about an hour, and it's gone by really quick.
young people for whom the whole deal that they've been offered just doesn't seem to be there anymore.
Is this idea of collective revolting, which Occupy Student Debt was calling for.